I'll need this to bring this down to a Jewish height. Now, if you picked up one of these brochures, right in the middle you have the outline for the first of the studies, the Modern Jewish State and Bible Prophecy. If you don't have one, raise your hand. We'll get one passed out to you real quick. So there's just a few hands up. So if we can get the brochure out to them, that would be great. Now, on the theme of the modern states of Israel and Bible prophecy, there are 5 different perspectives. We'll deal with the first 3 perspectives in the introduction part of the outline, and then we'll deal with the other 2 as we get into the middle and then the second page of the outline. For introduction, there are 3 perspectives initially that we're going to deal with. And the first perspective is that of replacement theology. The principles of replacement theology began to rise very early in the early 2nd century, and it became a major doctrine of the visible church in the 4th century, primarily thanks to a man called Augustine or Augustine. And the basic view of different facets of replacement theology is that when Israel rejected the Messiahship of Yeshua, the Messiahship of Jesus, at that point God also rejected Israel. And now all of the covenantal promises were transferred from Israel to the church. Now they recognize that the church is not fulfilling these covenantal promises or prophetic promises in any literal way. And so they come up with the fact that you have to interpret these statements, prophecies, covenantal promises, have to be interpreted allegorically or spiritually. It was not intended for it to be fulfilled in any literal way. So about the modern Jewish state, for them the modern Jewish state is simply an accident of history. It does not fulfill any prophecy, nor is there any prophecy about a regathering of Israel in the future. So the second perspective disagrees with the first one. And the second perspective points out that the different prophecies and different promises made to the Jewish people will someday be fulfilled literally. And therefore, it's not to be interpreted allegorically or spiritually. But when they deal with the modern Jewish state, they have a hard time seeing how the modern Jewish state fulfills any real prophecies. So I do agree with the first view that the modern Jewish state is only an accident of history, does not fulfill any prophecy. But they disagree with the first view that these prophecies will someday be fulfilled. So let's begin by looking at 3 passages that will provide us with 3 passages that they have a difficulty with as far as trying to fit the modern Jewish state in Bible prophecy. So let's turn our Bibles to the first passage on the screen, which is the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30. Now, chapters 29 and 30 is a unit. And sometimes the question is raised, well, as part of the 5th book of Moses, wouldn't this be part of the Mosaic covenant? Why are we making it a distinctive from the Mosaic covenant? And the reason we need to do so is looking at chapter 29, verse 1. 29, verse 1. These are the words of the covenant which Jehovah commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. Horeb is a mountain range. In that mountain range is Mount Sinai. And that's where the initial facets of the Mosaic law and the Mosaic covenant were being dealt with. But he points out that the covenant of chapters 29 and 30 is a distinctive covenant than the Mosaic covenant. And so essentially the Mosaic covenant came to an end with the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy. And now chapters 29 and 30 are often called the Palestinian covenant, better referred to it as the land covenant. As you keep reading from verse 2 of chapter 29 to the end of the chapter, it points out that when the Jewish people finally enter the promised land, they'll fall into periods of disobedience. They'll bring on different forms of divine discipline. First of all will come subjugation, fulfilled in the days of the judges. Secondly will come captivity, fulfilled by the Assyrian captivity, followed by the Babylonian captivity. But then thirdly came a worldwide dispersion, which came as a result of the rejection of the prophet like unto Moses, which Moses covered in this same book back in chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. Chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. And when you get to the end of chapter 29, the worldwide dispersion is a fact. And even to this day, there's still more Jews outside the land than inside the land. But keep in mind that at the time the Bible books and verses were numbered, they were not written this way. That happened later. So chapter 30 just naturally continues to past the end of chapter 29. So look at chapter 30, verse 1. And it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you shall call them to mind among all the nations, whither Jehovah your God has driven you, and shall return unto Jehovah your God, and shall obey his voice according to all that I command you this day, you and your children, all your heart and with all your soul. Then Jehovah your God will turn your captivity and have compassion upon you, and return and gather you from all the peoples whither Jehovah your God has scattered you. If any of your outcasts be in the uttermost parts of heaven, from thence will Jehovah your God gather you, from thence he will fetch you. And Jehovah your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will do you good and multiply you with above all your fathers. And it continues in the same theme all the way to the end of chapter 30. So what we find here is a prophecy that speaks of a worldwide regathering, but he points out it's a regathering in faith, in preparation for blessing, and specifically the blessings of the Messianic kingdom. And this is obviously not fitting the modern Jewish state of Israel, where only a small minority of the Jewish population of the land actually are Messianic Jews. Let's go to the other example on the screen, Isaiah chapter 27. Isaiah chapter 27. Zionism originally was mostly a secular movement of the Jewish community. It was not a spiritual movement. And the early days of Zionism, mainline orthodoxy and ultra-orthodoxy rejected that movement. As a result of the events of World War II, mainline Judaism, including Orthodox Judaism, now totally supports Zionism as a place for Jews to go and live where they won't be constantly persecuted, as has been true for centuries and centuries. And but initially, Zionism was a secular movement, and the leaders of Zionism, when they were offered Uganda, they were actually contemplating starting a new state of Israel in Uganda. Well, most Jews would not go along with that, and that almost caused a division in Zionism until it was unified again when everybody rejected that only in the land of Israel can the state of Israel be reestablished. So in chapter 27, verse 12, it shall come to pass in that day that Jehovah will beat off his fruit from the flood of the river unto the brook of Egypt, and ye shall be gathered one by one, all you children of Israel. And in verse 12, notice, he gives us the northern border of the promised land, the river, that refers to the Euphrates River. And some people identified the brook of Egypt as to be the Nile River. That cannot be accurate because if the brook of Egypt is the Nile River. The Jews were already in the promised land before they ever left Egypt. But this is more of a wadi. Today it's called Wadi El Arish in the central Sinai. And that actually is the southern border of the promised land. And so he promises a regathering of a believing people to all of the promised land. Never in ancient history have the Jews possessed or settled in all of the promised land. Lebanon is part of the promised land, but also that part of the promised land the Jewish people didn't have. And there are things of that nature. And even the modern state of Israel still does not have all of the promised land. But in the promise over here, when the Jewish people are in the final restoration, one by one, every Jew is going back to the land from the northern border to the southern border. And now look at verse 13. It shall come to pass in that day that a great trumpet shall be blown, and they shall come that were ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and they that were outcast in the land of Egypt, and they shall worship Jehovah in the holy mountain at Jerusalem. And here we see the spiritual reason why the Jews will be moving back, one by one, till every Jew is back in the land. They want to come back and gather to worship God in the holy mountain, which would be the Temple Mount. And so if you put these two verses, it's describing a worldwide regathering in faith, in preparation for blessing. So this doesn't fit the modern Jewish state as it now exists. For the third example, let's look at Ezekiel chapter 39. Ezekiel chapter 39. The context begins in verse 25 of Ezekiel 39. We'll pick up our reading in verse 27. When I have brought them back from the peoples and gathered them out of their enemies' lands, and am sanctified in them in the sight of many nations, and they shall know that I am Jehovah their God, in that I caused them to go into captivity among the nations, and have gathered them unto their own land, and I will leave none of them there any more. Neither will I hide my face any more from them, for I have poured out my spirit upon the house of Israel, says the Lord Jehovah. Notice he's describing a believing nation now brought back to the land. They're being welcomed by the surrounding nations, which is not true with the modern Jewish state, that the modern Jewish state has made peace treaties with several of the Arab surrounding nations. We'll say more about that in the afternoon study. But now is in this passage that surrounding nations are welcoming the Jewish return. And more significant in verse 29, it's in connection with God pouring God's Spirit upon the house of Israel, the whole people. Obviously, that has not happened with the modern Jewish state. So this is another example which the second perspective has a difficulty with, and in trying to accept the modern Jewish state as any fulfillment of Bible prophecy. So again, they disagree with the first perspective. All of these prophecies will someday be fulfilled, but they do not recognize Israel fulfilling any of such prophecies and so on. Then you have a third perspective. And the third perspective is now claiming that the modern Jewish state is the beginnings of the final restoration. This is the final act. And God will gather more and more Jews back into the land. Somewhere in the process, there'll be a national salvation of Israel, though they're not all agreeable as to the timing of this national salvation. And once all the Jews are back, there'll be a believing people, which will then lead them to the Messianic kingdom. So for this period, this group of people, there is no need to look for any other difference. This is the beginnings of Israel's final restoration. And when one of the congregations we planted in St. Petersburg, Russia, members of this group came in saying, it is nice to believe in Yeshua, nice to believe in Jesus, but that's not the final stage. You must quickly pack everything and move to Israel. Because if you don't go back to Israel fairly soon, you'll undergo a divine judgment from God. And when they pointed out, what about a specific tribulation before the actual final restoration? Their claim was, what we see today and what we saw in the Nazi Holocaust fulfilled all of the tribulation prophecies. And therefore, there's no future tribulation. And therefore, this is the beginnings of the final restoration. In the Messianic congregation I was a member of when I was still living in California, a member of this view came in and again proclaimed to the Jewish members of the congregation, you must pack your bags and move to Israel as soon as possible. Otherwise, you'll fall under God's divine judgment. And again, his claims was that the Nazi issue fulfilled all of the tribulation prophecies. When the elders of the congregation pointed out, it also mentions Babylonia. But to him, Babylonia was simply Jeremiah's symbol for the USA, which would surprise a lot of Americans. It would definitely surprise the prophet Jeremiah. And when they pointed out, it also mentions the Mississippi River, his response was, well, the Mississippi River is simply the Euphrates River is simply a symbol of the Mississippi River in the USA. So yes, Jeremiah said Euphrates, but that was simply a symbol of the Mississippi, and therefore you've got to pack up and start moving. And so in this third perspective, there is no future tribulation, and because there are more Jews in America for a long time than there are in Israel, though in the last couple of years, the Jewish population finally superseded the American Jewish population in number. But what we see now is just the beginnings of the final restoration. Now, at all three of these first perspectives fail to recognize the Bible speaks of two different worldwide regatherings. First of all, a worldwide regathering in unbelief, in preparation for judgment. The judgment specifically is the tribulation period. But then there will be a second worldwide regathering in faith in preparation for blessings, which will be the blessings of the Messianic kingdom. So the three passages we already looked at clearly speak of a worldwide regathering in faith in preparation for blessing. But nothing in terms of 3 + 1 + 3. 3 + 1 + 3. We'll now look at three other passages which shows a different kind of worldwide regathering. A worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. The judgment will be the tribulation. The tribulation will bring about Israel's national salvation. And Israel's national salvation is the prerequisite to the second coming. And the second coming is a prerequisite to the Messianic kingdom. And so this will be a bit different than the first three passages we read. So it'll be 3 + 1 + 3. For the first three, I just went through this one, two different worldwide regatherings. So let's go to Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel chapter 20. We'll begin with verse 33. As thou livest, says the Lord Jehovah, surely with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, and with wrath poured out, and I will be king over you. And I'll bring you out from the peoples, and will gather you out of the countries wherein ye are scattered, with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, with wrath poured out. And I'll bring you into the wilderness of the peoples, and there will enter into judgment with you face to face. Like as they entered into judgment with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt, so will enter into judgment with you, says the Lord Jehovah. And I will cause you to pass under the rod. I'll bring you into the bond of the covenant, and I will purge out from among you the rebels and them that transgress against me, and I'll bring them forth out of the land where they sojourn. But they shall not enter into the land of Israel. You shall know that I am Jehovah. Notice he's writing this in the background of the sojourn out of Egypt. And as the Jewish people left Egypt after spending many years in servitude, and he brought the Jewish people under Moses, and they came to the area of Sinai, and specifically Mount Sinai, where they stayed for approximately 1 year to accomplish two things. Number one, to receive much more of the law of Moses, which wasn't merely 10 commandments, but altogether 613 specific commandments God gave to Moses. And also they need to build a tabernacle through which much of the Torah, much of the law could then be maintained. And then with those two things accomplished, approximately 1 year after arriving at Sinai, they were to press on and enter into the promised land itself. But then, because of murmurings and rebellings against God's revealed will, finally at the oasis of Kadesh Barnea, God entered into judgment with the Exodus generation. Now they'll have to continue wandering in the wilderness of the Sinai, the deserts, until 40 years pass. In that 40-year period, all those who came out of Egypt will die out, those who are of the age of 20 upward, and so on. So 40 years later, it was a new generation, the wilderness or desert generation, that will finally enter the land under Joshua. And that historical background is now the background of what he's describing here as the future. That God will begin to regather his people from different parts of the world. It'll be a regathering in unbelief. And gathering out of wrath, the wrath of the Nazi Holocaust, but also gathered for wrath, the wrath of the tribulation. And the tribulation judgments, 2/3 of the Jewish population would die. That's not in this passage. It's in Zechariah 13, verses 8 and 9. Zechariah 13, verses 8 and 9. 2/3 of the Jewish population will die out of persecution, but 1/3 is left. And this 1/3 is the all Israel that shall be saved. And when the whole nation is saved, then they can plead for the Messiah to return, which he will return. He left because of Israel's rejection in Matthew chapters 12 and 13. And now he will return because of Israel's acceptance. And then they will enter into the Israel of the Messianic kingdom. But here you see a judgment in unbelief, a gathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment before the national salvation itself. So a prophecy like this, notice, is quite distinctive from the first three prophecies we read. For a second example, let's go to chapter 22. In chapter 20, it was regathering in the land in general, but now in chapter 22, it focuses more specifically on Jerusalem. But note again the same principle, a regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. Verse 17 of chapter 22, and the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, Son of man, the house of Israel has become dross unto me. All of them are brass and tin and iron and lead in the midst of the furnace. They are the dross of silver. Therefore, thus says the Lord Jehovah, because you all become dross, therefore, behold, I will gather you into the midst of Jerusalem, as they gather silver and brass and iron and lead and tin in the midst of the furnace to blow the fire upon you and to melt it. So I will gather you in mine anger, and in my wrath I will lay you there and melt you. Yea, I will gather you and blow upon you with the fire of my wrath, and ye shall be melted in the midst thereof. As silver is melted in the midst of the furnace, so shall ye be melted in the midst thereof. And ye shall know that I, Jehovah, have poured out my spirit upon you, have poured out my wrath upon you. So notice, similar to what we saw in chapter 20, but now focusing on Jerusalem, a regathering into Israel's capital, Jerusalem. Here again, it's a regathering in unbelief, because they're filled with the impurities of lead and tin and iron and brass. And the purpose of bringing them into the tribulation, the wrath of the tribulation, is to cleanse them from these things, to bring them into a national salvation. And in this manner, that fulfills the prerequisite to the second coming. Not the prerequisite to the rapture, but prerequisite to the second coming. And thus the regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. That judgment will bring them to national salvation before we have the final worldwide regathering. Let's look at one more example. And we'll go to the book of Zephaniah. The minor prophet Zephaniah. Now the first chapter of Zephaniah describes in some detail the day of Yahweh, the day of Jehovah, the day of the Lord. And that is the most common biblical name in both testaments, for we now call the tribulation or great tribulation. But the most common biblical term is what you see here, the day of the Lord. And chapter 1 describes what a terrible time that will be. But as you come to chapter 2, notice uses the word before, and depending on your translation, it may be used 3 times or 4 times. But the word before emphasizes, as we shall about to see, that Israel's regathering in unbelief has to occur before the day of the Lord starts, before the tribulation begins. So Zephaniah chapter 2 verse 1, gather yourselves together, they gathered together a nation that had no shame. Before the decree bring forth, before that they pass as the chaff, before the fierce anger of Jehovah come upon you, before the anger of Jehovah come upon you. So notice before the day of Yahweh, the day of the Lord, the day of Jehovah comes, there has to be a regathering. But it's a regathering unbelief because they're not yet ashamed of their sins. And the reason to bring them into this period of trial is to bring them to a time of recognizing their failure and finally come to recognize who the Messiah was when he first came, and then call upon the Lord to bring them to bring the Messiah back. But here again, you see a regathering in unbelief in preparation for the tribulation. So that's the exact timing. We don't know when before the tribulation, but the regathering in unbelief has already happened. And so we're just waiting for the next stage in Bible prophecy. So that's the first 3. Let's go to the +1, and let's go to Isaiah chapter 11. Isaiah chapter 11. You can mark down what's on the screen right now, Ezekiel 36, verses 22 to 24, also describing a regathering before a national regeneration. We now come to the 4th perspective. The 4th perspective recognizes what the first 3 perspectives did not recognize. The Bible clearly speaks of 2 different types of worldwide regatherings in unbelief, in preparation for judgment, followed by worldwide regathering in faith, in preparation for the blessings of the Messianic kingdom. But having recognized this much, the 4th perspective says this: we cannot be sure that the modern Jewish state today fulfills the prophecies of the worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. And why not? Because from their perspective, you could have a worldwide regathering followed by a dispersion. Another regathering of unbelief followed by another dispersion. Even a 3rd worldwide regathering in unbelief and followed by dispersion. And that being the case, we cannot be sure that the modern Jewish state is a fulfillment of the prophecies we just read, the first 3, that speaks of worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. Isaiah 11 will help to clarify that. The entire context is chapter 11, verse 11 to chapter 12, verse 6. Isaiah 11:11 to chapter 12, verse 6. It speaks of a worldwide regathering in faith in preparation for blessing. Now, how is that relevant to our present topic and the modern Jewish state? It's relevant because it numbers the worldwide regathering in faith. So let's look at chapter 11, verse 11. It shall come to pass in that day, the Lord will set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people that shall remain from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Now, this is speaking of the final worldwide regathering in faith, in preparation for blessing, the blessings of the Messianic kingdom. So how is this relevant to our present topic on the modern Jewish state? Notice he numbers the final worldwide regathering as the second one in verse 11. He numbers it as the last one as the second one. If the last one is the second one, how many more can you have before that one? Even with new math, there can only be two worldwide regatherings. One is the worldwide regathering we see now with the modern Jewish state coming together in unbelief in preparation for judgment. But when they enter the tribulation, ultimately, they'll undergo a national salvation, and then that will fulfill the prerequisite to the second coming. Keep in mind, the rapture has no prerequisites. Whatever prerequisites there were in the first coming have already been fulfilled. So it can come at any moment of time. And if you look at Paul's statements of the rapture event in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, he clearly shows the rapture will occur sometime before the day of the Lord. But we do not know. The rapture can happen any moment of time. There's no other prerequisite. There are no signs for the rapture. But there's a key prerequisite for the second coming before Israel's final restoration. And that is coming to faith. So there has to be two things. Number one, they confess their sin, are rejecting the Messiah. The details of that confession are in Isaiah chapter 53, verses 1 through 9, Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 9. And then, secondly, they must call on the Messiah to return, to mourn for him as one mourns for only son. Until those two things occur, there's no second coming. So, two regatherings. And this Isaiah prophecy mentions there's only two worldwide regatherings, no more. You cannot have a third, fourth, and a fifth. And that. So now let's go to the other plus three. Three corollary issues all relevant to the modern Jewish state in Bible prophecy. And the first of the other plus threes is the start of the tribulation. And let's turn to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. In Daniel chapter 9, beginning in verse 24 and down through verse 27, is one of Daniel's famous prophecies about the 70 sevenths that God has decreed over your people in verse 24, Daniel's people, the Jewish people, and your holy city, Daniel's holy city, which was Jerusalem. It goes beyond our purpose to go phrase by phrase, because that goes beyond the point of this whole study. But if we just simply go through it, whether you have done it or will do it, this is what you discover. By the end of verse 26, the first 483 years of this 490-year period has already been fulfilled in history, coming at the time of the first coming of the Messiah. But there's still 7 years left to run of this prophetic time clock over Israel. Those are the same 7 years of the tribulation. So now the question is, what is the one singular event they'll begin the last 7 years taken away. And now we come to verse 27 of Daniel chapter 9. And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 7. The pronoun he goes back to his nearest antecedent. A nearest antecedent is found in verse 26 as the prince that shall come. The prince that shall come. In other words, the prince that shall come in verse 26 and the he who makes a covenant in verse 27 is one and the same individual, better known in our circles as simply the Antichrist. And the people out of which the Antichrist will come will be from the people that destroyed the city and the temple. Not that the prince himself will destroy it. That'll be done by the Romans in the year AD 70, where they'll destroy the city and the temple. But that shows that the Antichrist will be a Gentile or Roman origin. And a Gentile or Roman origin he will be. And he will rise to power, and he's going to make a firm covenant with the Jewish leaders, the ones in power to be able to represent Israel and signing a covenant of this nature. So keep in mind, it's not the rapture of the church that triggers the tribulation. The rapture simply precedes the tribulation by some unknown period of time. But the event that actually triggers the 7 years is the signing of the 7-year covenant between Israel and the Antichrist. And that is the event that will trigger the tribulation and the 7-year period. Let's go to the second part of the +3, the third temple. Isaiah 28 also, by the way, elaborates on Daniel 9:27. But that didn't take time to go through all of these details and so on. But Isaiah 28, verses 14 to 22. I might just make one corrective from a misconception, is that the 7-year treaty will be a peace treaty. The word shalom is not found here, nor is the word shalom found in the Isaiah passage. The 7-year signing of a treaty simply guarantees Israel's military security. It's not a peace treaty. It simply signals Israel's military security. And so Israel's protected for the first half of the tribulation. Things will change at the midpoint. But the presuppositions we see here is, number one, the Antichrist is already in a high political power before the tribulation. Another presupposition, there's already a Jewish state and a Jewish government existence. This has already been true since 1948. Israel became a state in 1948. They have a Jewish government. But the second thing about the Antichrist being Catholic authority, this has not yet taken place. But the first part has taken place, and now there'll be a second aspect. Let's go to capital B, the second thing of the last two things, the third temple, the tribulation temple. I'm going to read 4 passages of scripture, then I'll make my observations. Let's go back to Daniel 9, verse 27. And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 7, and in the middle of the 7, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And upon the wing of abominations shall come one that makes desolate, and even unto the full end, and that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. Second passage is Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24, we begin with verse 15. When therefore ye see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of to Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let him that reads understand. Then let them in Judea flee unto the mountains, and so on. Let's go to the next passage, which will be 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We'll read verses 3 and 4, 2 Thess 2, verse 3 and verse 4. Let no man beguile you in any wise, for it will not be except the falling away come first, and the man of sin be revealed, the sin of perdition, he who opposes and exalts himself against all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sits in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. Last passage will be Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. Verse 1, and there was given me a reed, like unto a rod, and one said, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein, and the court which is outside the temple leave without. Measure it not, for it has been given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. These four passages describe an event that occurs at the midpoint of the tribulation. But at the midpoint, the Jewish temple is already standing and functioning. Because at the midpoint, the Antichrist will take over the Jewish temple, proclaim himself to be God, and call upon the whole world to worship him as God and signify their acceptance of his deity by taking his mark of 666. Now that event is called the abomination of desolation. It will happen at the midpoint of the tribulation. So what that means is that by the midpoint of the tribulation, the temple is standing and functioning. So it has to be rebuilt before the midpoint of the tribulation. That gives us two options. One option is it might be rebuilt in the first half of the tribulation. A second option is it might be rebuilt even before the tribulation starts. We cannot make it more specific than that. So it's either going to be rebuilt in the first half of the tribulation or before the tribulation starts, because by the midpoint it's already functioning, already built and functioning, and the Antichrist will cause a forced cessation of the sacrificial system and so on. Now, one of the byproducts of the Six-Day War is this. In 1948, Israel became a state, but only was able to maintain control of the west side of the new city of Jerusalem, and that was the Jewish area. The east side, which was the Arab territory, was maintained by the Jordanians for 19 years, from 1948 to 1967, and the whole old city was under Jordanian control for those 19 years. One of the key byproducts of the Six-Day War is that finally Israel was able to take control over the whole, what they called the West Bank, that part of the main land of Israel that Jordan had controlled. And furthermore, for the first time, the old city has fallen under Jewish control. Not only the old city, but also the temple compound. So only then did it become a possibility for the rebuilding of the temple. It hasn't started yet. There's a group called the Institute of the Temple Compound. This is a group that is very orthodox, not ultra-orthodox, but very orthodox. And what they've done is build all of the various aspects. It's called the Temple Institute, and if you visit them, if you go to Israel at any point of time, they're inside the Jewish quarter of the old city. They made all of the necessary items they need to put into the temple once the temple is done. And so with that being able to be true, and last time I went, which was last June, they actually have fulfilled almost everything they need, but the building is not yet happening. Another element is called the Ataret HaKohanim, meaning the Institute of the priesthood. And most Jews don't know what tribe they're from. I don't know what tribe I'm from. More than one friend of mine said they think I come from an ancient Jewish Indian tribe called the Schmohawks. I don't buy it. But The one tribe that kept their identity, the rabbis made sure they kept their identity because the tribe is the tribe of Levi that's essential for the temple. And so they separated Orthodox Jews who are members of the Cohens. You see Jewish people named Cohen, Kohn, Cohn, something like that. Just the Hebrew word for priest. These are direct descendants of Aaron. And they are now undergoing training to do proper sacrifices. They can't do the proper sacrifices just yet because there's no temple. But they're training people to do so when necessary. Some questions about the temple. What about the Ark of the Covenant? Some evangelicals believe the Ark of the Covenant is essential for the atonement. But the Ark of the Covenant did not survive the Babylonian destruction. When the Jews rebuilt the Jewish temple, when they came back from Babylonia, they did not have an Ark of the Covenant. So what the Jewish people had was a foundation stone of the Solomonic temple, the first temple, which was brought into the Holy of Holies, and the blood was sprinkled every year on the Day of Atonement on that foundation stone, and God accepted it. Until Messiah died, God accepted that atonement. And furthermore, in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 16, Jeremiah 3:16, it clearly specifies that the Ark of the Covenant will not be in the millennial temple. And of all the list found in Jeremiah 52 of what Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple into captivity into Babylonia and the city of Babylon, it did not include the Ark of the Covenant. So Jewish groups are not trying to find the Ark of the Covenant. It's only evangelical Christian groups that think God needs some help to fulfill his prophecies. But the Ark of the Covenant won't even be in the millennial temple, as we know from Ezekiel's prophecies. What about the ashes of the red heifer? The laws of the red heifer are found in Numbers chapter 19. And in Numbers 19, it's not a sacrifice per se. It's not even killed in a temple compound. And they usually kill the red heifer on the Mount of Olives, burn it to ashes, and then they would have to mix the ashes with water and the ashes of the red heifer. And the purpose is to remove ceremonial uncleanness. Remove ceremonial uncleanness. So before any of the Kohanim can function in the priesthood, they have to undergo the sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer. Now the Mosaic law, all there has to be is primarily a reddish-brown cow, but Rabbinic Judaism, Pharisaic Judaism, made it more stringent. It could not have more than 2 white hairs or 2 black hairs. So there's a Texan rancher who had several perfect red heifers. He shipped them all the way to Israel that they could use, except for not the stringency, not of the Mosaic law, but Rabbinic law. That for the heifer to be kosher, to become the red heifer, it could not be born in Texas. It must be born in Israel. It must be a Jewish cow. It cannot be a Gentile cow. So what they've done with the red heifers that he shipped, using generic engineering to try to produce the red heifer, a perfect one with no more than 2 white hairs or 2 black hairs. And so far they've not been successful. But eventually they'll have to come along with something. But there's no reason to try to find the previous red heifer ashes, as some evangelicals have been trying to find. All right, the last thing of the +3, let's go to Ezekiel chapter 38. Ezekiel chapter 38. This is capital C on your outline. Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 1, going into chapter 39, verse 16, is the whole information about the Gog and Magog war. The chapter got divided along spots, so as verse 17 of chapter 39 has nothing to do with Gog and Magog. Every new paragraph always begins the same way, speaking to Gog and Magog. Magog itself is the territory between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and today that's modern Russia. I'm not going to go through this verse by verse. It goes beyond the main point I'm trying to make. But Magog, again, is South Russia. And so whoever Gog is, he's a Magogite. And whoever the leader is, the word Gog is not a name, it's a title of the king of Magog, in the same way that Pharaoh is not a name. Pharaoh is the title of the king of Egypt. Tsar is not a name, it's the title of the king of Russia. Kaiser is not a name, it's the title of the king of Deutschland or Germany. So there's no need to look for someone by the name of Gog. But whoever this will be, he'll come from the Magog territory, which today is part of southern Russia. Now let's see what kind of Israel they invade. Look at chapter 38, verse 8. 38:8. After many days you shall be visited. In the latter years you shall come into the land that's brought back from the sword, that's gathered out of many peoples upon the mountains of Israel, which have been a continual waste, but is brought forth out of the peoples, and they shall dwell securely, all of them. Now skip down to verse 12. To take the spoil, to take the prey, to turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, against the people that are gathered out of the nations have gotten cattle and goats that dwell in the middle of the earth. Notice he's describing Israel that's come back to the land that have escaped from the sword where they have been gathered from. And the wrath they suffered beforehand was the wrath of Nazi Germany. But then, now they've been brought back. They've begun to rebuild many of the cities that have been laying waste for centuries. They've been regathered out of wrath in unbelief. It's not describing an Israel which existed in ancient times. He's describing an Israel that came into being as of 1948. So regardless of how we deal with the timing of this invasion, one thing is clear, this invasion could only happen after 1948. Only then Israel was a state that could be invaded. And the main goal is spoils of war. But as the chapter continues, at the end of chapter 38, the different natural and supernatural cataclysms that God will use will destroy this entire invading army. But now look at chapter 39, verse 2. Notice the place where the army will be destroyed. Chapter 39, verse 2, and now will turn you about, and will lead you on, and will cause you to come up from the uttermost parts of the north, and I'll bring you upon the mountains of Israel. Verse 4, you shall fall upon the mountains of Israel. The mountains of Israel refers to the central mountain range. And it begins at the south end of the Jezreel Valley, the south end of the Galilee. It runs the whole length of the country, all the way down, and finally peters out just north of Beersheba. And it is the central mountain range that includes the cities you see on the screen: Dothan, Shechem, Samaria, Shiloh, Bethel, Ai, Ramah, Bethlehem, Hebron, Debir. But what the army is moving towards is Jerusalem, Israel's capital. And once the whole army penetrates Israeli defenses and goes into the mountain range of Israel, that is when God will move directly and bring the army to an end. Now, if you look at the closing verses of chapter 38, verses 17 through verse 23, 17:23, I found different prophecy teachers who tend to be more sensational rather than just staying with the text. That they're trying to say that God is going to use somebody else's air force to destroy these enemies. And the most popular air force to use is the USA Air Force. Now, how wide is Israel? Only 50 miles wide, that's it. If you drop a nuclear bomb, which is what these people think will happen, if you drop a nuclear bomb in the middle, as far as I know, they have not invented a nuclear bomb with a little label there for Gentiles only. It'll wipe out everybody, Jews, Gentiles, and so on. But what this shows is that God directly will take his own ways to destroy the whole army. Some are natural events, but some are supernatural events. So by the time this runs the course, not one single member, like King James reads, 1/6 of the army is left alive. That's not in the Hebrew text. It's not part of the Hebrew text. Not one member of this whole army will succeed in surviving. They'll all be destroyed. So not only could this invasion not happen before 1948, it could not happen before 1967 because the mountains of Israel were under Jordanian sovereignty. So if you look at the border of Israel before the Six-Day War, the border on the north comes along the foot of the mountains, moves south at the foot of the mountains. It then cuts in, cuts Jerusalem in two, got out again, and then around the mountains of Israel. And so Israel had only 5% of the mountains of Israel. It did not include the old city yet. That happened only in 1967. But that whole section then became subservient to Israel in the Six-Day War. And so this invasion has to happen only after 1967 and couldn't happen before 1967. So some conclusions. So the present Jewish state is not a fulfillment of those prophecies that speak of a worldwide regathering in faith in preparation for blessing. It is a fulfillment of those prophecies that speak of a worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. And as we see how God is fulfilling bit by bit all of the prophecies he made, we can take some measure of security, because God has made certain promises for the body and the bride of the Messiah. And those promises are made distinctive from the promise of the second coming. And just as our blessed hope is not, we need to find out who the Antichrist is. No, we don't need to find out who he is. We need to find out who Gog is. No, we don't need to find out. Our blessed hope is the actual coming of the Messiah in the air, and there'll be the resurrection of the church saints that have died, and there'll be a catching up or rapture of the church saints which are living. And together we'll be caught up and meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we evermore be with the Lord. That's our blessed hope. Whether we see any more prophecies fulfilled or don't see any more prophecies will be fulfilled, our blessed hope is still the rapture of the church.